The cold metal of the firearm's safety clicked off with a bone-chilling snap, echoing through the desolate mountain ravine just as Special Agent Elena Vance pulled back the rotted vines to reveal a skeletal pilot still strapped into the cockpit of a ghost military helicopter. This wasn't just a crash site, it was a tomb for a secret that had been waiting 10 years to kill again. Before we uncover the terrifying truth hidden within that rusted fuselage, please subscribe to our channel and stay with us until the very end to see how Elena survives the hunt. Also, comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The silence of the Blue Ridge Mountains was deceptive, a heavy lid of gray clouds pressing down on the jagged peaks as Elena Vance stepped out of her SUV. She wasn't here to solve a case, she was here to survive the noise in her own head. Beside her, Atlas, a muscular German shepherd with an intelligent, notched ear, surveyed the tree line with the intensity of a soldier who never truly clocked out. "Elena. You made it through the sleet," Sarah Whitaker called out, waving from the porch of a secluded stone cabin. Sarah's smile was warm, the kind of practiced kindness that people in the mountains use to fill the silence. Elena nodded, her gray-green eyes already scanning the cabin's perimeter for exits. "Thanks for the short notice, Sarah. I just needed some air." "Honey, everyone needs to breathe after the week Asheville's had," Sarah replied, handing over the key. "Just stay on the marked paths. The forest has its moods. If you hear something weird tonight, it's just the wind playing tricks." "My imagination retired years ago, Sarah," Elena said, her voice dry and unromantic. But as Sarah's truck disappeared into the mist, Atlas let out a low, vibrating whine that didn't sound like a greeting. He pressed against Elena's thigh, his amber eyes fixed on the dark sermon of the hemlocks. The next morning, the forest felt raw, the drizzle turning the leaves into a slick, glossy trap. Elena moved with a measured stride, her hand hovering near the radio on her belt out of pure muscle memory. "Just a hike, Atlas," she murmured. "Easy day." Atlas didn't agree. He stopped so abruptly that Elena nearly stumbled over him. His body went rigid, a low growl rolling from his chest like thunder trapped in a jar. He wasn't looking at the deer tracks ahead, he was staring into a ravine where the ground fell away steeply. "What is it, boy?" Elena whispered, her heart rate spiking. Atlas barked once, sharp, insistent, a sound that signaled a find. He pushed into the thicket, leading her down a slope slick with moss and decay. As they dropped lower, the air grew heavy, smelling of damp earth and something metallic. Elena saw it then, an unnatural scar through the trees where trunks had snapped years ago. Atlas began pawing frantically at a wall of vines. "Atlas, back," Elena commanded, clicking on her flashlight. She grabbed a curtain of vines and yanked. Instead of rock, her beam hit dark olive paint and rusted rivets. She tore away more foliage to reveal a massive rotor hub and blades twisted like broken bones. It was a military helicopter, half buried and forgotten by the world. "What the hell is this doing here?" Elena breathed. She leaned into the shattered cockpit. The beam caught the tattered flight suit of a pilot, his helmet wedged at a final, desperate angle. Elena stood at attention for a single, silent beat, a ritual for the fallen that she couldn't suppress. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the shadows. Atlas wasn't mourning. He scratched at a floor panel near the pilot's feet. Elena pulled a pry tool from her pouch, working the edge until the metal gave way with a dull protest. Hidden in a secret compartment was a rectangular, matte black object wrapped in a rubberized sleeve. A ruggedized military hard drive. "This wasn't an accident, Atlas," Elena muttered, her investigative instincts flaring. This was cargo. The forest suddenly went unnaturally still. Above her, on the slope they had just descended, the distinct click of a firearm's safety echoed through the trees. Elena's blood turned to ice. "Atlas," Stay, she breathed, her voice barely a ghost of a sound. She didn't turn. She didn't run. She measured her inhales, sensing the presence of a hunter watching her from the green. She retreated with ritualized care, circling back to the cabin through gullies and switchbacks to break her scent. Inside, she bolted the door and set the hard drive on the table like an accusation. She powered up a laptop and connected her satellite hotspot. The drive was protected by military-grade encryption, layered with authentication prompts that screamed of high-level secrets. "Who were you, flyboy?" Elena asked the empty room as she mapped the encryption. A knock at the door made her reach for her sidearm before she saw Sarah Whitaker through the peephole, carrying a paper bag. Elena opened it just an inch. "I brought soup," Sarah said, her eyes flickering toward the laptop and the maps on the table. "Weather's worse tonight. If you hear anything strange, it's probably just the wind." "Probably," Elena replied, watching Sarah's retreat. The moment the door closed, Atlas returned to the window, his hackles rising. Elena ignored the soup and focused on the drive. She tried a combined code, a sequence of letters from a metal tag Atlas had found near the wreck and a date stitched into the pilot's collar. The interface hesitated, then shifted. The first gate fell. Directories appeared, manifests, comms, intel. Elena opened the manifest first. Serial numbers for equipment were labeled as surplus, but the routing codes were for destinations that didn't exist on any public map. She opened an audio file in the comms folder. A woman's voice, calm and chillingly exact, filled the cabin. "Delivery windows are confirmed. Plausible deniability is the priority. Our partners prefer distance, and the money prefers silence." "That voice," Elena whispered, her jaw tightening. She opened the final video file. The screen bloomed with an image of a high-end office overlooking a familiar skyline. A woman in her late 40s sat behind a desk, her hair styled to perfection, her eyes a cold, polished shine. The nameplate on the desk caught the light. Elena felt the air leave her lungs. It was a name she recognized from the highest levels of her own agency. Suddenly, a status icon blinked on the laptop screen and vanished. A beacon program had executed itself the moment the video was opened. It had used the satellite link to send a single packet of data, Elena's exact location. "Atlas, we're out of time," Elena said, her voice even despite the adrenaline. Atlas was already at the door, muscles coiled. Outside, a matte black drone slid across the clouds with a smoothness that mocked the wind. It hovered, adjusting its altitude by a hair, its lens focused directly on the cabin. "They aren't coming to talk, Atlas," Elena muttered as she killed the lights and began dragging the heavy oak table to brace the door. She laid out her sidearm and spare magazines in the dark. The first impact hit the door like a sledgehammer. The table groaned. Then, the side window shattered as a rifle butt punched through the shutter. "Go!" Elena shouted. Atlas surged forward, a blur of fur and fury exploding through the broken window just as the first round stitched across the wall. His savage bark wasn't noise, it was a weapon, drawing the attacker's fire away from Elena. Elena kicked out the back window and slipped into the freezing night. Behind her, the cabin erupted in the hollow crack of wood and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. She didn't look back as she plunged into the rhododendron thickets, her lungs burning, her mind already racing toward the coordinates she had memorized from the drive. The hunt had begun, and the forest was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield. The cold mountain air bit into Elena's lungs as she and Atlas vanished into the shadows of the ravine, the cabin behind them becoming a funeral pyre of wood and secrets. Elena did not look back. She could hear the heavy thud of tactical boots hitting the porch and the muffled shouts of men who had traded their souls for a paycheck. "Keep moving, Atlas," she whispered, her voice a jagged sliver of glass. The dog didn't need the command. He moved like a ghost through the rhododendrons, his body low to the damp earth, his ears swiveling to catch the high-pitched hum of the drone circling above the canopy. Every snapping twig felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, Atlas stopped, his hackles rising as he turned his head toward a cluster of boulders. Elena froze, her hand flying to the grip of her sidearm. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged, but it wasn't a mercenary. It was Sarah Whitaker, but the kind woman with the soup was gone. She held a suppressed submachine gun with the casual grace of a professional killer. "You should have eaten the soup, Elena," Sarah said, her Appalachian lilt replaced by a cold, neutralized accent that sent a shiver down Elena's spine. "It would have been much more peaceful." Elena felt a surge of betrayal that tasted like bile. "How long, Sarah? How long have you been sitting on that crash site?" Sarah's eyes were dead. "Longer than you've been a badge. Now, give me the drive." Before the last word left Sarah's lips, Atlas launched himself. He didn't bark, he was a silent, black and tan streak of fury. Sarah fired, the suppressed rounds hissing into the trees, but Atlas was too fast. He slammed into her chest, the force of 65 pounds of muscle sending both of them tumbling down a steep embankment. "Atlas!" Elena screamed, lunging after them. She found them at the bottom, Sarah pinned under the dog's weight, her arm locked in Atlas's jaws. Sarah was reaching for a backup blade in her boot. Elena didn't hesitate, she brought the butt of her pistol down on Sarah's temple, silencing the threat. She pulled Atlas away, checking him frantically for wounds. "You're okay, boy. You're okay," she breathed, her hands shaking as she felt for blood. But there was no time for relief. The drone above had dipped lower, its searchlight cutting through the mist like a vengeful eye. They had to move. Elena snatched Sarah's radio, hearing the frantic chatter of the team closing in. Target escaped the primary. Moving to the secondary perimeter. All units, kill on sight. They scrambled deeper into the mountains, choosing gullies and switchbacks that made Elena's legs scream in protest. "We can't just run, Atlas. They have eyes in the sky," she muttered. She looked at the ruggedized hard drive in her pack. The beacon was likely still active, a digital tether drawing the hunters closer with every second. She needed to reach the Widow's Maw, the abandoned coal mine her father had mentioned in his old logs, the place where signals went to die. But as they crested a ridge, Elena saw a fleet of black SUVs blocking the only bridge over the gorge. She was trapped between the cliff and a wall of lead. Over the edge, Elena whispered, looking at the whitewater rapids hundreds of feet below. Atlas looked at her, his amber eyes wide, sensing her fear. He didn't hesitate, he nudged her hand with his wet nose, a silent vow of loyalty that broke Elena's heart. They jumped just as a volley of gunfire tore through the air where they had stood. The impact with the water was like hitting concrete. Elena was sucked under, the current a chaotic, freezing monster that tried to tear the pack from her shoulders. She fought for the surface, gasping for air, searching for a flash of fur. "Atlas," she choked out. A black head emerged 20 yards downstream, struggling against the whirlpools. Elena swam with everything she had, her fingers clawing at the water until she grabbed his collar. Together, they were swept into the darkness of a limestone cavern where the river disappeared into the mountain's throat. The cavern was a cathedral of dripping stone and echoing silence. Elena dragged herself and Atlas onto a muddy bank, her body shivering so violently she could barely stand. She pulled out a waterproof flashlight, its beam revealing a maze of tunnels propped up by rotting timbers. This was it, the back entrance to the Widow's Maw. But as she checked the hard drive, she noticed something that made her blood run colder than the river. The drive wasn't just a ledger, it was a countdown. A small LED on the casing was blinking red. Self-destruct in 30:00. They didn't just want it back, Atlas. They wanted us to find it, Elena realized, her voice echoing off the damp walls. It's a trap. The moment I decrypted the final file, it alerted them, and now it's going to erase itself and us with it. She looked at the dog, who was sniffing a rusted iron door at the end of the tunnel. He scratched at the metal, a low whine escaping his throat. Elena pushed the door open, expecting Lin Dan Thew, mercenaries, but instead, she found a room filled with monitors and server racks, all humming with an eerie, blue light. In the center of the room sat a man in a tattered flight suit, his back to her. "You're late, Special Agent," the man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He turned around, and Elena's heart stopped. It was the pilot from the helicopter, the man she thought was a skeleton. He wasn't a ghost, he was a survivor who had been living in the shadows of the mine for a decade. "I've been waiting 10 years for someone with a dog brave enough to follow the scent." Elena leveled her weapon at him. "Who are you?" The man smiled, a hollow, haunting expression. "I'm the reason your agency is burning. And if you want to stay alive for the next 20 minutes, you're going to do exactly what I say." Outside, the mountain shook. The mercenaries had found the mine entrance and were using breaching charges. "They're here," Atlas growled, his ears pinned back. The pilot stood up, revealing a prosthetic leg made of scavenged helicopter parts. "Let them come," he said, reaching for a heavy lever on the wall. "The widow's maw hasn't had a good meal in years." Elena gripped Atlas's collar, the weight of the conspiracy finally settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore, she was holding the fuse to a bomb that would either destroy the corrupt elite or bury her along with the truth. The air in the room grew thick with the smell of ozone and old earth as the first explosion tore through the outer door. "Ready, Atlas?" Elena asked. The dog barked once, a sound of pure, defiant will. The final stand had begun. The heavy iron door buckled under the first breaching charge, the shockwave rattling the server racks and sending a shower of rust and dust over Elena and the man who should have been a ghost. The pilot, whose flight suit was now a tattered second skin of survival, didn't flinch. He simply watched the monitors as thermal blooms began to crawl across the screen like glowing insects. There in the primary access tunnel, he rasped, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the servers. Elena gripped her sidearm, her knuckles white, while Atlas crouched low, his hackles a rigid line of black fur as he let out a growl that felt like it was vibrating through the very soles of her boots. "How did you survive 10 years in this hole?" Elena asked, her voice tight with a mixture of suspicion and awe. The pilot didn't look at her, his fingers moved over a keyboard with a rhythmic, clicking speed. "The forest forgot me, but the mountains didn't. I stayed alive because I had something they couldn't find." He pointed to the blinking red light on the hard drive she had placed on the console. "They aren't just here for the data, Agent Vance. They're here to make sure the witness and the evidence burn together." A second explosion, much closer now, made the floor jump. Elena felt a sharp sting in her shoulder, a reminder of the glancing hit she'd taken at the cabin, and she cursed under her breath. Atlas, eyes on the door. The dog moved with predatory grace, positioning himself behind a collapsed mining cart, his amber eyes locked on the darkening threshold. "We have 20 minutes before that drive erases itself," the pilot said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And probably 10 before Sarah and her team realize there's a back way out." Elena's head snapped toward him. "Sarah? You knew she was part of this?" The pilot gave a hollow, bitter laugh. "Sarah Whitaker isn't a mountain woman. She was the logistics officer who signed off on my final flight. She's been babysitting this crash site for a decade, waiting for the one thing I took before I crawled out of that cockpit." Suddenly, the monitors flickered and died. The hum of the servers plummeted into a terrifying silence. "They've cut the hard line," the pilot whispered, reaching for a rusted rifle leaning against the desk. The darkness was absolute for a heartbeat before Elena's tactical flashlight cut a jagged hole in the gloom. Movement. Atlas barked, a sharp, savage alarm that was followed immediately by the rhythmic fut-fut of suppressed gunfire. Rounds stitched across the server racks, sparks spraying like tiny stars. Elena rolled behind a heavy metal filing cabinet, returning fire with controlled pairs. "They're using night optics," she yelled over the din. "We're blind in here." The pilot didn't answer. Instead, he pulled a small polymer strip from his pocket, the same kind Elena had found in the pilot's collar, and snapped it into a slot on the side of the main console. "Not blind," he hissed. A low, rhythmic thumping began to pulse through the room, and suddenly, the emergency lights flared to life, but they weren't white, they were a deep, pulsing red. The transition was so sudden that the mercenaries at the door, caught in their night vision goggles, screamed in pain as the light washed out their sensors. Atlas didn't wait. At Elena's silent signal, he surged forward, a gray-black blur of muscle and fury that hit the first intruder before the man could rip the goggles from his face. The struggle was brief and brutal. Elena heard the snap of bone and a man's agonized cry as Atlas did what he was trained to do, neutralize the threat with relentless purpose. She moved up, her weapon leveled, and saw Sarah Whitaker standing in the doorway, her face twisted in a mask of professional disgust. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be, Elena," Sarah said, her voice calm despite the chaos. "Just give us the drive and the pilot, and I'll make sure the Bureau remembers you as a hero who died in the line of duty." Elena didn't hesitate. She fired a round that grazed Sarah's ear, forcing the older woman back into the shadows of the tunnel. "I'd rather be a living traitor than a dead pawn, Sarah." "The drive," the pilot yelled, his voice urgent. "It's starting the final wipe." Elena scrambled back to the console, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she fought the military-grade encryption she had seen at the cabin. The progress bar was a death sentence, crawling toward 100%. "I can't stop the wipe, but I can redirect the packet," she shouted. "I need a satellite link that hasn't been jammed." The pilot pointed to a heavy iron lever near the ceiling. "The ventilation shaft. It leads straight to the peak. There's an old emergency transmitter built into the mountain spine." Elena looked at Atlas, who was now standing guard at the inner door, his chest heaving, his amber eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt. "Atlas, with me." They sprinted toward the rear of the chamber, the pilot limping behind them on his scavenged prosthetic. The tunnel was narrow and slick with the moisture of the deep earth, the sound of the waterfall outside muffled to a distant, hungry roar. Every few yards, they heard the hollow thump of more breaching charges. The mercenaries were systematic, they were collapsing the mine sections behind them to ensure there was no retreat. "They're burying us alive," the pilot muttered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Doesn't matter," Elena replied, her mind focused on the coordinates she had memorized. "If we reach the transmitter, the truth gets out. They can't kill a signal." They reached the base of the ventilation shaft, a vertical climb of 50 feet through rusted rungs and dripping stone. Atlas looked up, his ears pricked, sensing the air from above. Elena fashioned a makeshift harness from her climbing rope, securing it around the dog's chest. "I'm going up first. When I signal, you pull the lever on the winch." The pilot nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. The climb was a nightmare of burning muscles and slick iron. Elena could hear the voices of the search team entering the chamber below. "Search every crevice. Find that drive." Sarah's voice echoed up the shaft, cold and relentless. Elena reached the top, her fingers raw and bleeding as she hauled herself onto a small, wind-swept ledge hidden behind a cluster of ferns. She pulled the rope taut, and a moment later, Atlas was beside her, his paws scrambling for purchase on the wet rock. She opened her pack and pulled out the hard drive, its red light now a frantic, constant pulse. Come on, she whispered, plugging it into the emergency transmitter. The signal bars flickered, 1, 2, then stabilized. Link established, the computer chimed. But as the upload started, a shadow fell over the ledge. Elena looked up into the barrel of a high-powered rifle. It wasn't Sarah. It was a man she didn't recognize, his face covered by a tactical mask, his eyes as indifferent as the stone around them. Give it to me, Agent, he said, his voice distorted by a vocoder. Elena looked at Atlas, then at the hard drive, and finally at the man. You're late, she said, a small, humorless smile touching her lips. The truth already has its boots on. At that exact moment, Atlas launched himself not at the man, but at the transmitter's power cable, his teeth severing the wire in a spray of sparks. The man fired, the round sparking off the rock inches from Elena's head, but the shock of the dog's movement had thrown his aim. Elena lunged for her sidearm, but a second figure emerged from the ferns, tackling her to the ground. It was a chaotic, desperate struggle on the edge of the abyss. She felt the cold bite of the wind and the spray of the waterfall as she fought to stay on the ledge. Atlas, defend, she screamed. The dog was a whirlwind of fury, his jaws locking onto the first attacker's arm, pulling him toward the drop. But then, a low, ominous rumble began to shake the entire mountain. The breaching charges below had triggered a massive structural failure. The mine is collapsing, the pilot's voice drifted up the shaft, followed by a terrifying, grinding roar of stone on stone. The ledge beneath Elena's feet groaned and tilted. She reached for the hard drive, her fingers brushing the plastic casing just as a section of the cliffside gave way. She felt herself falling, the world turning into a blur of gray stone and white water. Atlas, she cried out, her hand reaching into the void. She felt a familiar, heavy weight pull at her jacket. Atlas had caught her, his teeth locked into her shoulder strap, his body braced against a surviving root. They hung there, suspended over the raging pool below, as the mountain behind them seemed to fold in on itself in a cloud of dust and thunder. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the falls and the frantic, rhythmic thumping of Elena's own heart. They were alive, but the transmitter was gone, and the drive was lost in the rubble. Or so she thought, until she felt a hard, rectangular shape pressing against her ribs inside her jacket. She had saved the drive, but they were now trapped on a crumbling cliff with no way down and a team of hunters who would be looking for the bodies. The dust from the mountain's collapse tasted like ancient, pulverized bone, clogging Elena's throat as she clung to the shivering root that anchored her and Atlas to the cliffside. Below them, the green pool churned with the debris of a decade-old lie, and for a moment, the only sound was the frantic, wet rasp of Atlas's breathing. I've got you, boy, Elena choked out, her fingers digging into the dog's thick ruff as she stabilized her weight against the crumbling ledge. The hard drive pressed against her ribs like a cold, heavy heartbeat, a physical reminder that the truth was still breathing, even if the world felt like it was ending. She looked up, expecting to see Sarah Whitaker's cold eyes peering over the rim, but there was only the jagged, raw scar of the mountain and the indifferent spray of the waterfall. A sudden, sharp whistle cut through the roar of the water, not a bird, but a tactical signal. Elena's pulse hammered. They're moving to the base of the falls, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cascade. Atlas shifted, his muscles bunching as he found purchase on a narrow stone outcropping, his eyes never leaving the ridgeline where the mercenaries had been silenced by the landslide. They couldn't stay here, the rock was too soft, the rain-slicked earth too eager to pull them into the abyss. Elena began a grueling, lateral crawl across the cliff face, her boots slipping on patches of wet moss that felt like ice. Stay close, Atlas, she urged, her hand guiding him whenever the path narrowed to a mere sliver of granite. Every time a stone broke free and vanished into the mist below, Elena felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror, not for herself, but for the dog who had become her only anchor in a world of betrayal. They reached a small, hidden hollow behind the main curtain of the falls, a place where the air was a constant, freezing mist. "Check the drive," she muttered to herself, her fingers fumbling with the waterproof casing. The red light was gone, replaced by a steady, menacing amber. The self-destruct had paused, but the data was locked in a state of digital purgatory. If she didn't find a way to finish the upload soon, the pilot's sacrifice and Atlas's loyalty would be for nothing. Suddenly, Atlas let out a low, vibrating growl, his nose pointed toward the back of the hollow. "Who's there?" Elena demanded, her sidearm leveled at the darkness. A figure emerged, but it wasn't a soldier. It was Ben Carter, the journalist whose name had been on the pilot's letter, looking disheveled and frantic. "Special Agent Vance." "I saw the smoke from the ridge," he said, his voice gravelly and thick with a cynical exhaustion. "You're harder to find than the truth in this town." Elena didn't lower her weapon. "How do I know you weren't followed?" Ben held up a small, battered satellite phone. "I've been dodging Sarah's cleanup crews for 3 days. They think I'm still in Asheville." The ground shook again, a secondary tremor from the mine's collapse. "We don't have time for a biography, Ben," Elena snapped, shoving the hard drive into his hands. "This is the Black Ledger. Everything Sarah and her masters tried to bury with that helicopter is on here." Ben's eyes widened as he took the drive, his hands trembling. "You found it. You actually found it." But before he could say another word, a red laser dot danced across his chest. "Get down." Elena tackled Ben just as a high-velocity round shattered the rock where his head had been. Sarah Whitaker stood on a ledge across the ravine, her posture sharpened by a decade of waiting for this exact moment. "Give it up, Elena." Sarah's voice boomed through a megaphone, distorted and hollow. "The mountain is your tomb. Make it easy on yourself and the dog." Elena looked at Atlas, whose amber eyes were burning with a fierce, protective light. "Never," Elena whispered. She looked at Ben. "Can you broadcast from here?" Ben shook his head, his face pale. "The spray is jamming the signal. We need to reach the Widow's Peak, the highest point on this ridge. It's the only place with a clear line of sight to the satellite." They moved out of the hollow, using the heavy mist as a shroud. The climb was a vertical marathon, Elena's shoulder flaring with a white-hot agony that she suppressed through sheer force of will. Every time she flagged, Atlas was there, his head pressing into her knee, grounding her, reminding her that they were a team of two that the mountains couldn't break. They reached the summit just as the clouds began to tear open, revealing a cold, iron-gray sky. "Do it now," Elena commanded, covering the only trail up the peak. Ben plugged the drive into his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. "Uploading, 30%, 50. The hum of a drone returned, a matte black dot sliding across the clouds with a predatory precision. It wasn't just watching anymore. Elena saw the flash of a missile launch from its underside. "Incoming." She threw herself over Ben and Atlas just as the summit exploded in a roar of heat and shrapnel. The force of the blast sent her sliding toward the edge, her fingers clawing at the frozen earth. She felt a familiar, heavy grip on her jacket. Atlas had her again, his teeth locked into her sleeve, his paws braced against the rock with an unbreakable strength. 70%. Ben shouted, his voice cracking. He was huddled behind a boulder, the phone held high like a sacred relic. Elena scrambled back to her feet, her vision blurring, her sidearm empty. She saw Sarah Whitaker emerging from the smoke at the top of the trail, her rifle leveled. "It ends here, Elena," Sarah said, her voice devoid of the kindness she had used to mask her rot. "I agree," Elena said, looking at Atlas. She didn't give a command, she didn't have to. Atlas knew the rhythm of her heart better than she did. He launched himself not at Sarah, but at the unstable rock formation directly above her. 65 pounds of muscle and fury collided with the leaning granite, triggering a localized rockfall that sent Sarah tumbling backward into the darkness of the ravine. "Upload complete," Ben whispered, the screen of the phone glowing with a final, triumphant green. Elena slumped against a hemlock tree, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She looked at Atlas, who walked over and sat at her side, his notched ear twitching as he listened to the silence that finally returned to the mountains. The truth was out. The packets were hitting every major news desk and federal oversight committee in the country. But as Elena looked down at the hard drive, she saw the amber light turn to a steady, peaceful green. It wasn't a self-destruct anymore, it was a beacon. "Help is coming, Atlas," she said, her hand finding the soft fur of his neck. Real help this time. But the silence was broken by a sound that made her blood turn to ice once more. Not a drone, not a helicopter, but the rhythmic, heavy thud of a single pair of boots walking toward them from the shadows of the trees. A man in a pristine suit, unbothered by the mountain's wrath, stepped into the light. "Excellent work, Agent Vance," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. "You've done exactly what we needed you to do. Now, give me the drive, and we can begin the real work." Elena looked at the man, then at the drive, and realized with a sickening jolt that the conspiracy didn't end with Sarah Whitaker. It was just getting started. The man in the pristine suit stood like a jagged splinter of glass against the raw, bleeding sky of the mountains, his presence an insult to the grit and sweat Elena had left on every rock face. Elena felt the hard drive's weight in her hand, no longer a trophy of truth but a leaden anchor pulling her back into the abyss of bureau politics. "Director Miller," Elena spat, her voice a low rasp that carried the sting of the freezing mist. Atlas didn't wait for a command, he stepped in front of her, a low, tectonic growl vibrating through his chest that made even the director's polished composure flicker for a microsecond. "You didn't come here to rescue us," Elena realized, the betrayal settling in her gut like cold iron. "You came to ensure that the Black Ledger didn't reach anyone you couldn't control." Miller sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "I came to ensure national stability, Elena. That drive contains names that keep the world turning. You and that journalist are just noise in a very large machine." Ben Carter clutched the satellite phone, his face a mask of cynical terror as he realized the upload he thought was a victory had actually been a homing beacon for the highest levels of power. Suddenly, the hum of the drone returned, but this time it wasn't alone. Two high-altitude interceptors shrieked across the iron-gray clouds, their shadow momentarily plunging the peak into darkness. "The transmission went through, Miller," Ben shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate defiance. "Every news desk in the country has those manifests now." Miller didn't flinch, he simply tapped his earpiece. "Actually, Ben, they have a corrupted data packet that will be flagged as a foreign disinformation campaign within the hour. Unless, of course, I have the physical drive to verify the contents." The depth of the rot made Elena's vision blur for a heartbeat. She looked at Atlas, seeing the same fierce, protective light in his amber eyes that had carried them through the widow's maw. "Atlas, go," she whispered, a command so quiet it was almost a prayer. The dog didn't run for the trail, he launched himself at Ben, knocking the journalist flat just as a sniper's round from a hidden position shattered the hemlock tree behind them. "He's not just a dog, Miller. He's the only honest witness you have left." Elena screamed, pulling her backup blade as she lunged toward the director. Miller stepped back, his hand reaching for a concealed holster, but he was too slow for a woman who had spent 4 days fighting for her life in the mud. She collided with him, the force of her momentum carrying them toward the edge of the summit where the waterfall's spray turned the air into a blinding curtain of white. "You think you're the machine?" Elena hissed into his ear. "You're just the rust." They tumbled onto the slick rock, the drive skidding toward the precipice. Atlas was a whirlwind of fury, intercepting a second operative who had emerged from the tree line. The dog's jaws locked onto the man's tactical vest, shaking him with a primal, bone-deep strength that ignored the pain of his own exhaustion. "Get the drive, Ben." Elena roared as she pinned Miller's arm against the granite. Ben scrambled for the black casing, his fingers brushing the plastic just as the first Federal Blackhawk crested the ridge, its searchlight pinning them like moths to a board. "Drop the weapon." "Federal agents," a voice boomed from above. "But whose agents were they?" Miller laughed, blood staining his teeth. "Those are mine, Elena. This is over." The helicopter's downdraft whipped the mist into a frenzy, making it impossible to see, impossible to breathe. Elena felt Miller's grip tighten on her throat, the world starting to turn gray at the edges. "Atlas," she gasped. Out of the whiteout, 65 pounds of muscle and will hit Miller like a freight train, the dog's weight tearing the director away from Elena. Atlas didn't bite, he stood over Elena, his body a living shield, his bark a rhythmic, thunderous defiance that seemed to shake the very mountain. In that moment of absolute chaos, a second set of rotors joined the first, not blacked-out Blackhawks, but a pair of marked Bureau Transport Hellos. "Director Miller, step away from the special agent," a new voice commanded over the loudspeaker. It was the assistant director, the one person Elias had told Elena she could trust if the world turned upside down. The Black Ledger hadn't just gone to the news, it had hit the internal affairs server via the secondary key Atlas had found in the pilot's remains. Miller's face went from triumph to a hollow, gray mask of defeat as he realized the signal hadn't been intercepted, it had been diverted. The arrests were swift and clinical, the mountains finally reclaiming their silence as Miller and his team were led away in zip ties. Elena sank to the wet earth, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as the adrenaline finally ebbed away, leaving her body a wreck of bruises and old scars. Atlas walked over, his fur matted with mud and the iron scent of the struggle, and placed his head on her knee. "We made it, boy," she whispered, her hands shaking as she stroked his notched ear. "The pilot can rest now." Ben Carter stood nearby, holding the drive like it was a holy relic, his cynical eyes finally holding a flicker of something like hope. Months later, the gold and red of an Appalachian autumn painted the hills around Elena's new home. She sat on the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in her hand, watching the way the light caught the changing leaves. She was back at work, but the mountains had changed her. She no longer saw the world as a series of stairwells and range days, but as a place where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. Atlas lay at her feet, a quiet, eternal sentinel whose tail gave a soft, rhythmic thump against the wood every time she looked at him. "You didn't just save a case, Atlas," Elena murmured, kneeling to press her forehead against his. "You saved the part of me that forgot how to trust." The Black Ledger had triggered a domino effect of justice, but the real miracle wasn't the arrests or the headlines. It was the four-legged oath that had refused to break when the world was at its darkest. As the sun dipped below the blue ridge, casting long, peaceful shadows over the yard, Elena realized that the silence was no longer something to fear. For those who have survived the impossible, the truth isn't just a destination, it's the partner who walks beside you every step of the way. The mission was complete, the bond was iron, and for the first time in 10 years, the ghost in the mountains was finally at peace. No shadow is long enough to hide the truth when a heart is brave enough to seek it and a guardian is loyal enough to find it.